At the edge of Butte, Montana, there is a hole in the earth so large it rewrote the map of an American city. It is roughly a mile across. Its walls descend in terraces of broken stone and abandoned ambition. At the bottom is water the color of oxidized metal, red at the margins, blue-green in the deeper light, beautiful in the way poison can be beautiful when distance makes it abstract. That lake did not exist by accident. It is what remains when a century of extraction is allowed to keep working after the company that caused it is gone. The pumps stop. The groundwater rises. The chemistry continues. The bill arrives late. Long before it became a toxic landmark, this place was part of one of the greatest industrial fortunes in American history. Copper from Butte helped wire the modern United States. It moved through streetcar systems, office buildings, shipyards, telegraph lines, telephones, wartime production, suburban expansion, and the hidden circuitry of everyday life. The company that controlled much of that flow did not merely operate in Montana. For decades it shaped the state's economy, its newspapers, its labor wars, and in the minds of many Montanans, its politics as well. The name was Anaconda. At its height, Anaconda was not just a mining company. It was a system. It owned mines, smelters, rail lines, timber, coal, manufacturing plants, newspapers, and company towns. It expanded out of Montana into Chile, Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and beyond. It became one of the most powerful corporations in the American West and, for a long stretch of the 20th century, one of the largest mining enterprises anywhere in the world. But empires built around extraction have a particular weakness. They often look permanent right up until the moment they stop being useful to the people who own them. Then what seemed immovable begins to unravel very quickly. This is the story of Marcus Daly, the immigrant who saw copper before most of America understood what copper was going to become. It is the story of the richest hill on earth, of the company town built to process its ore, of labor and blood and political control, of a global expansion that made the company rich enough to seem untouchable, and of a collapse so complete that a British oil company eventually inherited the cleanup for decisions made by 19th-century copper kings. And it is the story of what remains after corporate power recedes: the landscape, the poisoned water, the surviving brick stack, the memories of workers, and the uncomfortable truth that industrial triumphs are often measured in public celebration first and public cost much later. If you want to understand how a corporation can build a state, bend a labor force, miss the limits of its own model, and leave a legacy that outlives both its founders and its balance sheet, you start here. Marcus Daly entered the world far from copper, far from Montana, and far from anything resembling industrial power. He was born on December 5, 1841, in County Cavan, Ireland, in a society still shaped by rural hardship and colonial hierarchy. His family was large. Security was thin. Formal schooling was either limited or absent. What mattered was work, survival, and timing. In the years around Daly's youth, Ireland was not a place that promised broad horizons to poor children. It was a place that taught constraint. When Daly came to the United States as a teenager in the mid-1850s, he came the way millions did, without prestige, without capital, and without any guarantee that the Atlantic crossing would produce anything except a new version of the same struggle. New York did not receive immigrant boys as future industrialists. It received them as labor. If there was ambition in him then, it would have had to survive under invisibility. The early years matter because they explain what Marcus Daly did not inherit. He did not arrive with the education of a mining engineer. He did not have a family network waiting to place him inside a respectable business office. He did not learn the extractive industries through polite theory. He learned them under conditions where observation had to substitute for formal instruction. That path took him west. Like so many young men pulled by the logic of the 19th century frontier, Daly moved toward mining camps where ore, rumor, and chance were rearranging fortunes faster than older forms of society could keep up. He worked in California and then in Nevada, where the great western mineral rushes had already begun to sort men into categories: owners and laborers, speculators and technicians, dreamers and those who learned how mines actually worked. What made Daly different from many other workers was not simply that he was willing to endure underground labor. Plenty were. It was that he paid attention in a way that suggested the mine itself was becoming his education. Underground work forced intimacy with stone, heat, moisture, darkness, and risk. To a worker who cared only about the next shift, rock was something to move. To a worker like Daly, rock became information. In the Comstock region and other Western operations, he gained a reputation not as a flamboyant promoter but as a man who could actually manage mining work. That distinction is important. The American West produced no shortage of loud opportunists. It produced fewer men who understood the operational chain between discovery and profitable output. A deposit was not wealth until somebody knew how to develop it, finance it, move it, process it, and protect it from technical stupidity. Daly learned that whole logic in fragments, job by job. By the time he was connected to more serious investors, including men orbiting the great Western mining fortunes of the age, he had already acquired the quality that would define him for the rest of his life: disciplined geological intuition. He was not a scientist in the formal modern sense. He was something both older and more dangerous in a speculative economy, a field-trained operator who could look at formations, listen to reports, inspect workings, and form judgments faster than many men who outranked him socially. In Utah and Nevada he moved upward, taking on supervisory responsibility and earning the trust of people with capital. That trust mattered. Mining was a field in which labor knowledge and investor money needed each other, but rarely spoke the same language. Daly could translate between them. He understood what wealthy men wanted to hear, but he also knew what the rock was likely to allow. This is the first real hinge in the story. Before Montana, before Butte, before Anaconda became a corporate state, Daly had already become the sort of man who recognized opportunity where others saw routine. That ability would matter more than any single financing arrangement or legal maneuver that came later. The richest fortunes in mining history have often depended not simply on discovering a deposit, but on recognizing the significance of a deposit before the market has priced it correctly. Daly was moving toward that moment. In 1876, he was sent to Montana by the Walker brothers, Salt Lake City mining investors and bankers who trusted his judgment enough to send him to inspect properties in and around Butte. On paper, it looked like another assignment in another camp. Butte at that time was known more for silver than for the future copper empire it would become. To many outsiders, it was still one western district among several. To Daly, it looked different. He did not step into Montana as a romantic pioneer. He stepped into it as a trained eye shaped by 2 decades of rough education. He had seen enough mines to recognize that ore bodies tell stories in layers. Surface assumptions can be wrong. District reputations can lag behind geological reality. And what a market thinks it is buying can be very different from what is actually underground. That was the kind of insight a young immigrant boy from Ireland was not supposed to be in a position to act on. But by the time Marcus Daly reached Butte, he was no longer the boy who had arrived in New York with nothing except the necessity to work. He was a man who had turned observation into judgment and judgment into leverage. He still did not own the future, but he was close enough to see it. It helps to understand what Butte was before it became famous for copper, because the mythology of the place can make its transformation feel inevitable. It was not. Like many Western mining districts, Butte evolved through phases of hope, overstatement, technical experimentation, and sudden revaluation. Early prospectors chased different minerals at different depths. Silver mattered. So did the local logic of camp competition, land claims, and legal maneuvering. The hill was promising, but its future was not settled. That uncertainty is exactly what makes Marcus Daly's arrival so consequential. When Daly came to the district, Butte was already producing mineral wealth, but it had not yet become synonymous with the electrical age. The city that later called itself the richest hill on earth had not fully become that city yet. Mining camps are full of partial truths. A district can be known for the metal nearest the surface even while a deeper, larger, more consequential metal waits below. The mine most associated with Daly's early Butte years was the Alice, a silver property tied to the Walkers. He worked there as superintendent, which gave him an intimate view of both the promise and the limits of the district as it was then being understood. This is where the story becomes less about heroic discovery and more about correct interpretation. Daly began to suspect that some of the district's most important value lay not in silver but in copper-bearing formations that others were undervaluing. That suspicion mattered because the economics of copper in the late 1870s and early 1880s did not yet look as irresistible as they later would. Copper was useful, of course, but the massive explosion in electrical infrastructure that would transform it into the metal of modernity was only beginning to emerge. To commit capital aggressively to copper in Montana still required imagination. The property that would change everything was a claim called the Anaconda. It had been worked as a silver mine. It was not initially valued by the broader market as the cornerstone of a future industrial empire. That is the point. Great fortunes are often built when one person is operating on a timeline different from everyone around him. Daly was. He sold out of the Alice and moved to acquire the Anaconda, backed by George Hearst, James Ben Ali Hagan, and Lloyd Tevis, men with serious capital and a proven appetite for mining wealth. That alliance is sometimes treated as a simple financing footnote. It was more than that. It was the conversion of Daly's field judgment into enterprise scale. He could see the district differently. They could fund what his vision required. Then came the discovery that turned strategic intuition into fact. Roughly 300 feet below the surface, the Anaconda workings broke into extraordinary copper ore. Not a minor trace. Not a passing suggestion. A deposit of a scale that forced a revaluation not only of one mine but of the district itself. The consequences radiated outward quickly. Once copper became the story, the logic of Butte changed. The district was no longer merely another Western camp. It was becoming one of the most important mineral centers in the world. What Daly grasped earlier than most was that the value of the copper itself was only part of the opportunity. The larger opportunity lay in controlling the chain around it. Ore in the ground is inert wealth until somebody turns it into marketable metal, and then into products positioned at the center of a changing economy. Daly was already beginning to think in systems. That vision coincided with one of the largest technological shifts in American history. Electrification was expanding. Thomas Edison's work and that of many others was helping push electricity from experimental wonder into urban infrastructure. Telegraph networks were already dependent on conductive materials. Telephones were coming. Street lighting, streetcars, industrial wiring, consumer electrification, these things did not all arrive at once, but they were arriving fast enough to make copper increasingly strategic. Daly did not need to predict every detail. He only needed to understand the general direction. America was becoming a nation that would require vastly more copper than it had required before. If Butte could supply that metal at scale, and if his organization could process and ship it efficiently, The district could eclipse older copper centers and reshape industrial geography. This is where the Butte story stops being local. A mining camp transforms into an industrial node when geology, transport, labor, and technological demand align. Butte had geology. What Daly and his backers began assembling around it was the rest of the machine. Claims were consolidated. Capital poured in. Rivalries sharpened. Labor demand grew. And the city began its ascent toward the strange condition of being both frontier and metropolis, both immigrant town and industrial furnace. Butte would become famous for its headframes, hoists, underground depth, and rough politics. Yet all of that later spectacle began with a quieter moment. A man trained underground realized that the district's apparent identity was misleading. The hill was not merely a silver field with copper somewhere inside it. It was a copper empire waiting to be correctly named. Once that correction happened, the pace accelerated. Investors understood that land which had seemed merely interesting could be strategic. Claims became more expensive. Competition intensified. Ownership patterns started to matter in new ways. And because Western mining law rewarded aggressive claim behavior, legal conflict was never far behind economic opportunity. What Butte had been before the empire was valuable mainly because it shows how contingent the empire really was. There was nothing inevitable about Marcus Daly becoming the central figure in this transformation. There was nothing inevitable about the Anaconda claim becoming the core of a vertically integrated industrial machine. History is full of deposits that made money for somebody and then faded. What separated Butte was that its copper arrived in the right moment, and that the man positioned to exploit it thought not like a prospector but like a builder of systems. The hill still had to be conquered. The ore still had to be turned into output. The district still had to be stabilized enough to support large-scale industrial growth. But by the early 1880s, the essential fact had become clear. Marcus Daly had not found a mine. He had found the foundation of an empire. Once the copper was confirmed, Marcus Daly faced the central problem of all mineral booms: how to prevent geological luck from being trapped by logistical weakness. A deposit can be enormous and still fail to generate enduring fortune if the operation around it remains dependent on too many outsiders. Or has to be hoisted, sorted, transported, smelted, refined, and sold into a volatile market. Each step creates opportunities for delay, price manipulation, technical bottlenecks, or political dependency. Daly's answer was not modest. He moved toward integration. He did not want to be merely a mine owner shipping raw material into somebody else's industrial system. He wanted control over processing, over transportation, and eventually over enough of the surrounding chain that outside actors would have fewer chances to dictate his margins. That instinct separated him from operators who were content to discover wealth and then negotiate from weakness with the infrastructure around them. The first expression of that strategy was smelting. Smelting copper ore at scale required enormous capital, technical sophistication, and fuel. It also created smoke, waste, and public resentment. But it was essential if Daly intended to turn Butte's copper into true industrial power. In 1883, construction began on a smelter in the Deer Lodge Valley along Warm Springs Creek, west of Butte. The site would become the town of Anaconda. This choice was practical and political at the same time. The valley provided water and room. It also moved the worst of the smoke away from Butte itself, where smelter fumes were already becoming a problem. Industrial capitalism has often solved one local crisis by exporting it to a different place. Anaconda was, from the beginning, both a strategic masterstroke and an environmental transfer. What rose there was not just a processing facility but a company landscape. Housing, churches, schools, hospitals, commercial buildings, and civic institutions emerged under the gravitational pull of the smelter. This is one of the themes that has to be understood clearly if the later collapse is going to make emotional sense. Daly was not simply running an extractive business. He was building a social world around the business. That world had contradictions from the start. Company towns could provide stability, wages, public amenities, and upward mobility relative to other frontier conditions. They could also create dependency so deep that a town's identity and survival became inseparable from the company's priorities. Anaconda, Montana, was not unique in this respect, but it became one of the strongest examples in the American West. The transport problem was solved the same way, by refusing to remain dependent. When railroad rates and railroad power threatened to squeeze the business, Daly backed the creation of his own line, the Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific Railway. That decision again reveals the underlying logic of the empire. The point was not just to mine copper. The point was to reduce every vulnerable handoff between ore in the ground and money in the ledger. The more Daly built, the more obvious his operating philosophy became. He wanted a machine in which extraction, movement, processing, and sale were linked by ownership rather than by negotiation. This required enormous capital and constant expansion, but it also offered enormous resilience, at least when markets were favorable and management remained competent. And markets were about to become very favorable indeed. As the United States accelerated into the electric age, copper demand intensified. This was the kind of technological transition that reorders old hierarchies quickly. Industries built for one world suddenly discover that another material, another transport route, another manufacturing chain is about to matter more. Copper was becoming indispensable to the wiring of cities and infrastructure. The value of controlling large, high-quality copper production rose with every mile of wire laid in America. Daly saw the future in the metal, but he also saw the future in scale. He did not act like a man content to own one successful operation. He behaved as if the district itself had to be brought under a broader organizing logic before competitors, market fluctuations, and transport dependencies could fragment the opportunity. This is also where Marcus Daly begins to diverge from the romantic mythology of the self-made magnate. He was indeed self-made in the sense that he did not inherit the fortune. But the fortune he built was not the product of individual genius alone. It depended on financiers, on laborers from many countries, on legal structures that favored aggressive claim behavior, on rail connections, on engineers, on furnace workers, and on the fact that the electrical age exploded when it did. Daly mattered enormously, but the machine was always larger than the man. Still, leadership matters in the way a system is assembled. Daly appears in the historical record as harder to sentimentalize than some later industrial celebrities. He was not a master of polished public myth in the manner of later corporate founders. He was more grounded, more operational, more direct. Workers often remembered him as demanding but not abstractly managerial. He could be ruthless in business, but he understood that stable industrial operations required more than capital discipline. They required labor arrangements that did not push the workforce immediately toward rebellion. That distinction becomes especially significant later, when the company after Daly turns more overtly toward financialized power and political domination at the expense of the personal labor relationships he had cultivated. But even during Daly's life, there was no innocence here. Company towns are not built from kindness. Rail lines are not built from affection. Smelters do not rise because a man wants only to provide jobs. They rise because profit, control, and scale point in the same direction. By the late 1880s and 1890s, that strategy was paying off spectacularly. Anaconda's output rose. Butte's reputation changed. The city swelled with immigrants, investors, saloons, newspapers, boarding houses, speculation, union organization, vice districts, churches, and the hard intensity of a place built on underground risk and above-ground money. Anaconda, the town, became inseparable from the smelter. Butte, the city, became inseparable from the mines. The wager had worked. What began as a risky acquisition of a mine misread by many as just another silver play had become the anchor of an industrial network. Daly had not simply monetized a deposit. He had created a regional order organized around copper and around himself. The deeper irony is that systems built to reduce dependency often create it elsewhere. The more efficiently Daly connected mine, rail, smelter, and town, the more deeply Montana communities became tied to the decisions of one corporate center. That interdependence produced wealth on a scale the state had never seen. It also planted the conditions for later political resentment and historical grief. In the boom years, though, those future costs were easy to ignore. The furnaces burned. The rail cars moved. The ore flowed west to the smelter and outward into the nation's electrical bloodstream. The empire was no longer theoretical. We often describe corporations as if they operate inside political systems that remain basically separate from them. Anaconda complicates that picture. By the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the company was not simply a major employer in Montana. It was one of the central forces shaping the state's public life. To understand why people later spoke of the copper collar, you have to see how industrial scale translated into political pressure. The first thing Anaconda controlled was employment, directly and indirectly. Mines in Butte, smelting in Anaconda, transport links, timber, fuel, and associated businesses all depended on corporate decision-making. In districts built around extraction, payroll is not just an economic function. It is political leverage. When thousands of livelihoods are tied to one organization, every elected official understands that formal law and practical power are not identical. The second thing the company built was informational influence. Newspapers mattered intensely in this period. They were not peripheral branding devices. They were engines of legitimacy, local identity, partisan contest, and public pressure. Anaconda's growing control over newspaper assets helped create an environment in which criticism of the company could be muted, redirected, or framed through interests aligned with management. Montanans developed a vocabulary for this condition because they experienced it not as abstract media theory but as a lived imbalance. The phrase, copper collar, captured more than censorship. It captured the sense that the state itself wore a visible sign of corporate ownership. This does not mean Anaconda faced no opposition. Quite the opposite. Its rise unfolded amid bitter competition with other powerful men, most notably William A. Clark and, later, F. Augustus Hines. These were not quaint frontier rivalries. They were struggles over legal claims, railroad routes, newspaper influence, and political office. Montana's public life was shaped for years by battles among copper kings whose private fortunes had public consequences. The conflict with William A. Clark illustrates how little separation existed between business strategy and state development. Clark was a banker, lawyer, mine owner, and relentless seeker of political office. Daly backed campaigns against him and fought him in the press. The contest over whether Anaconda, rather than Helena, would become the state capital was one of the most visible episodes in this broader struggle. When Helena won, it was not merely a civic disappointment for Daly's side. It was proof that even a dominant industrialist could not engineer every formal outcome, though he might still dominate much of the state's practical life. Then there was Hines, whose genius lay not in building a system as large as Daly's but in using law to destabilize systems built by others. Hines exploited the apex doctrine in mining law, which could allow claims to underground ore bodies based on the surface expression of a vein. In a district as geologically complex and legally combustible as Butte, that doctrine became a weapon. Hines used litigation as a form of mining. He could challenge ownership, tie up operations, and force settlements by turning the structure of mining law against larger rivals. The result was chaos that was both legal and industrial. At several points, Anaconda's response to hostile legal conditions was not subtle. In 1903, during the company's struggle against Hines and the local legal environment that seemed to favor him, Amalgamated Copper shut down operations across Montana, throwing vast numbers of people out of work and effectively using economic paralysis as a political message. The goal was to force a change of venue law and remove key legal disputes from courts perceived as compromised. This episode deserves emphasis because it reveals, in hard form, what corporate power meant in a company state. Anaconda did not merely lobby. It could render economic life unlivable until the political system moved in the direction it wanted. The legislature complied. Operations resumed. And the lesson to the public was unmistakable. If the company chose to use its scale openly, there were few counterweights strong enough to stop it. At the same time, the places under Anaconda's influence were undeniably productive and, in some respects, socially dynamic. Butte became a city of extraordinary ethnic complexity. Irish, Cornish, Italian, Serbian, Finnish, Chinese, and many other communities left their mark on it. Churches, union halls, fraternal lodges, saloons, newspapers, schools, and neighborhoods grew in the shadow of headframes and hoistworks. Anaconda, Montana, developed its own civic life beneath the dominance of the reduction works and later the smokestack. For working families, the company was not an abstraction. It was the source of wages, danger, opportunity, resentment, and pride. That dual reality is central to the script. One cannot reduce Anaconda to a cartoon villain without losing what made it historically powerful. It created real prosperity for many people. It allowed workers without elite education to earn wages that could support families. It made towns possible. It also concentrated power to a degree that distorted democracy, intensified labor conflict, and weakened the state's ability to regulate the industrial order on which it depended. Marcus Daly himself died in 1900, before the company reached the peak breadth of its later corporate life. That timing matters. During his lifetime he could still function, at least in memory, as a human-scale industrial patriarch, hard, ambitious, self-made, but legible. After him, the company became more impersonal. Standard Oil, connected financiers, corporate managers, and professional executives turned Anaconda into something less personal and more structurally dominant. The public face shifted from founder to institution. Institutions, unlike founders, have fewer reasons to preserve sentiment once it interferes with margins. Under later management, efficiency, consolidation, and political discipline intensified. Labor relations hardened. Press control became more strategic. The company's statewide footprint widened. And in the minds of many Montanans, the copper collar tightened. This is the part of the story where an editor should let the visuals do serious work. Use newspaper mastheads. Use maps of ownership. Use photographs of downtown Butte, mine yards, company offices, and civic architecture in Anaconda. Show that the company was not hidden. Its power was visible in brick, payroll, smoke, and silence. It sat in the foreground of daily life. By the time the 20th century was underway, Anaconda had become much more than the success of one immigrant entrepreneur. It had become a governing fact of Montana. And governing facts always generate enemies, dependence, and costs that are not evenly distributed. The grandeur of Anaconda's rise can make it easy to forget that copper empires are built at the pace of human bodies, or does not move itself. Shafts do not sink themselves. Furnaces do not feed themselves. The wealth of Butte rested on miners, muckers, engineers, timbermen, hoist operators, smelter hands, rail crews, machinists, and the families whose lives were organized around shift changes, accidents, wage scales, and the possibility that one bad decision underground could leave a widow above it. Butte was not merely productive. It was intensely dangerous. Hard rock mining at the scale practiced there involved extreme depths, heat, bad air, blasting, unstable ground, long hours, and a level of constant hazard that could become normalized only because the workers living inside it had no practical choice but to normalize it. The city's physical character reflected that reality. Headframes rose over neighborhoods like industrial steeples. Mine whistles and shift traffic structured daily life. Boarding houses filled with men from across Europe and America who carried old ethnic identities into a place where the earth itself imposed a rough equality of danger. That danger helped produce labor consciousness. Butte became one of the most union-minded mining centers in the United States. The Western Federation of Miners had deep roots there. Skilled miners knew that without collective leverage, the company's need for continuous output would always push against their safety, wages, and autonomy. Labor in Butte was not only an economic force, it was part of the city's identity. You could hear it in political language, in newspapers, in funeral processions, and in the simple assumption that a man underground owed his fellow workers more trust than he owed management. During Marcus Daly's life, the company's relationship with labor was relatively less confrontational than it became later. That does not mean conditions were soft or that workers lacked grievances. It means Daly appears to have understood that large-scale industrial stability in a place like Butte required some accommodation to labor realities. He is remembered in part for dealing with workers more directly than later executives did, and for recognizing that a company could not ask men to descend daily into lethal environments while behaving as if they were interchangeable pieces of equipment. After Daly, that equilibrium frayed. As the company professionalized and financialized, workers increasingly faced a management culture more comfortable with abstraction than with reciprocity. A founder can still imagine himself negotiating with men. A corporation imagines itself managing costs. That change becomes important because Butte's workers were never going to accept corporate rule as a purely administrative matter. Their sense of dignity was built partly on craft, partly on ethnic and neighborhood solidarity, and partly on the knowledge that the company's wealth depended on labor few outsiders would willingly perform. There was also a kind of pride in Butte that should not be flattened into victimhood. The city's miners understood they were participating in one of the great industrial systems of their time. Butte copper traveled into the modern world. Workers knew that the wires, motors, and infrastructure of the age were not abstractions. They were linked to what came up out of the hill. A place can be both exploited and proud. In fact, industrial cities often carry those feelings together. That pride was reinforced by scale. At its height, Butte was a booming urban center of the interior West, dense with working-class institutions and social life. It was not a temporary camp. It was a city with theaters, churches, schools, labor halls, newspapers, and neighborhoods packed into a narrow geography of extraction. Immigrants who arrived there did not merely pass through. Many built families and identities rooted in the place. The mines could kill a man, but they could also pay enough to sustain a household in a way other Western work often could not. And then there was skill. Mining on the hill was not generic labor. It produced forms of knowledge that were embodied and local. Men learned specific shafts, rock behavior, ventilation patterns, and equipment rhythms. Foremen and crews developed practical understanding that lived in memory, routine, and instinct more than in formal manuals. Later, when Arco would buy the company and misread the value of that tacit knowledge, the consequences would be severe. But already in the early 20th century, Butte workers knew that what they carried inside them was not trivial. It was expertise earned underground. The company knew it too. That is one reason labor conflict in Butte could become so volatile. When workers understand both their replaceability in theory and their indispensability in practice, they acquire a sharper sense of their bargaining power, and of the company's willingness to pretend otherwise. This chapter in the finished documentary should dwell on faces. Not only the famous men at the top, but the anonymous workers in lineups, underground crews, families outside boarding houses, smelter shifts, union halls, and funerals. Butte's industrial story is often told through output numbers because output numbers are dramatic. Yet copper tonnage alone cannot explain why the city's later losses and environmental inheritance still feel morally charged. What makes them charged is that the people who produced the wealth were never the ones with final authority over the system that used them. By the 1910s, the pressures inside that system were becoming harder to contain. Labor organization remained strong, but internal fractures, national politics, wartime demand, anti-radical pressure, and company consolidation were changing the ground beneath it. The workforce was proud, skilled, and politically alive. The company was powerful, increasingly centralized, and determined to maintain control. Such arrangements can continue for years under prosperity. They become combustible under disaster. The event that fixed Butte's labor history and industrial danger in the American imagination came on June 8, 1917. At the Granite Mountain and Speculator workings, a fire broke out during installation or inspection work involving electrical cable deep underground. The precise sequence of ignition has been studied repeatedly, but the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Flame and smoke moved through connected workings with horrifying speed. Timbering, ventilation paths, shaft geometry, and the particular conditions of underground space combined to turn a local emergency into a mass suffocation event. By the time rescue efforts stabilized into recovery, 168 men were dead. It remains the deadliest hard rock mining disaster in American history. To narrate this section effectively, the script has to resist melodrama because the facts already contain enough. Men were trapped in blackness and poison air. Some tried to barricade themselves behind bulkheads. Some left notes. Rescue was chaotic, delayed, and in places physically impossible. Families waited above ground while the city struggled to understand what scale of death it was absorbing. The disaster was not a freak event disconnected from industrial culture. It took place inside a system where safety, output, technology, and corporate responsibility were already in tension. For workers, the fire confirmed what many already believed. The company's pursuit of production had outrun its willingness to submit to meaningful safety accountability. At that historical moment, the national context intensified everything. The United States had entered World War I. Copper was a strategic metal. Demand was immense. The pressure to keep production moving was extraordinary. In wartime, industrial management often gains moral language to justify decisions that would otherwise look nakedly economic. If the nation needs output, then risk can be framed as duty. But for miners in Butte, patriotism could not erase the fact that dead men underground were paying the price of operational decisions they did not control. The disaster triggered enormous anger. Roughly 14,000 miners walked off the job. Into this charged atmosphere came Frank Little of the Industrial Workers of the World, a radical labor organizer, anti-war voice, and gifted agitator whose presence in Butte would become legendary for reasons both inspiring and terrible. Little arrived with a broken body and uncompromising politics. He was outspoken against the war, hostile to company power, and fearless in the face of repression. That combination made him both effective and vulnerable. Butte in 1917 was already a city of grief, rumor, and class rage. The company wanted production restored. Federal wartime priorities aligned against radical disruption. Public speech that might have seemed protected in calmer times was being recoded as subversion. In the early hours of August 1, 1917, masked men kidnapped Frank Little from his boarding house, dragged him behind a vehicle, and hanged him from a railroad trestle outside town. A message pinned to his body served as both warning and signature. No one was ever convicted. For generations, the murder has stood as one of the clearest symbols of the violence that can gather around industrial conflict when corporate power, state force, anti-radical politics, and local fear intersect. Whether one frames it primarily as anti-labor terrorism, wartime vigilantism, or the culmination of a campaign to crush dissent, the essential point is the same. The system that had built immense wealth in Butte could also produce an atmosphere in which exemplary violence became thinkable. The funeral procession for Frank Little drew thousands. That image matters as much as the murder itself. It showed that despite fear, large parts of Butte still recognized him not as an outsider who had disrupted their peace but as a martyr to a structure they knew too well. And yet the company outlasted the immediate crisis. That is one of the hardest truths in this history. Industrial disasters and episodes of labor bloodshed do not automatically break the institutions associated with them. Sometimes they do the opposite. They expose the limits of resistance under conditions of concentrated power. Troops arrive. Speech is restricted. Men return to work because families must eat. Mourning turns into memory. Production resumes. The Hill keeps paying. Anaconda's position after 1917 was not undamaged, morally or politically. But it remained structurally powerful. The company had survived founder death, legal warfare, and a mass casualty disaster. It would survive this too. The deeper result of 1917 was not immediate corporate collapse but a hardening of relationships and a more enduring mythology of Butte as a place where labor and capital met without pretense. This chapter should not be edited as a simple interruption in the growth story. It is central to the story because it reveals what the empire cost while it was still expanding. Many corporate histories treat labor violence and industrial catastrophe as unfortunate side episodes occurring beside the real narrative of scale and profitability. In fact, they are among the clearest expressions of how that profitability was made possible. The men who died in the Granite Mountain speculator disaster were not outside the empire. They were inside it. Frank Little was not an accidental footnote. He was part of the political terrain the company itself helped create. After 1917, Anaconda remained formidable. But the moral shape of that power was harder to romanticize. The company could still point to output, jobs, national importance, and engineering accomplishment. Workers and critics could now point to something else. A city where enormous wealth had proved entirely compatible with sealed exits, mass death, anti-labor force, and an unsolved lynching. Empires often continue long after their legitimacy begins to corrode. In some ways, that is when they become most dangerous, when they are still strong enough to enforce obedience but no longer believable as mutually beneficial institutions. By the end of the First World War, Anaconda was still expanding. But the cost of its rule had become much easier to see. If the 1917 disaster revealed the underside of Anaconda's power, the decade that followed revealed how large that power had become. The company was no longer merely the master of Butte and Anaconda. It was becoming an international industrial enterprise with ambitions that reached far beyond Montana. This expansion was driven partly by confidence and partly by necessity. Rich or districts do not remain static forever. Costs change. Competitors emerge. Metal markets cycle. A firm that wants to preserve dominance must decide whether to defend its original center at all costs or extend itself into new geographies and new stages of production. Anaconda chose extension. The company's control over Montana remained deep. Its influence over newspapers and politics continued. It processed enormous amounts of copper and fed a nation that still depended on the metal for electrical systems and modern infrastructure. But growth increasingly meant looking outward, to refining, manufacturing, and foreign ore bodies that promised scale on a new order. This is where the story moves from Western industrial history into the wider history of American corporate globalization. In the 1920s, Anaconda acquired major operations abroad and downstream manufacturing positions at home. The company purchased interests in Mexico and, more importantly, the great Chilean copper mine at Chuquicamata. It also bought American brass, expanding its reach from mined or toward finished copper and brass products used across the economy. In strategic terms, this was a classic move toward fuller vertical integration. Instead of stopping at extraction and smelting, the company pushed further into fabrication and value-added production. The logic made sense. If the future of copper was global, the future of Anaconda had to be global too. Chuquicamata was the crown jewel of that expansion. Located in Chile's Atacama Desert, it was among the largest copper deposits in the world. Unlike the deep underground complexity of Butte, Chuquicamata offered a different scale and mining profile. It represented not just another productive asset, but a shift in the geography of Anaconda's center of gravity. Over time, the Chilean mine would generate a huge share of the company's profits. This was a triumph, but it also introduced a structural vulnerability the company would eventually pay for dearly. For the moment, however, success overshadowed risk. Anaconda entered the interwar years as a company of startling breadth. It was involved in mining, smelting, refining, transport, manufacturing, timber, coal, and an expanding network of related industrial operations. It stood among the most consequential corporations associated with the American resource economy. For investors and corporate managers, it could appear that the company had done what all great industrial systems attempt: transformed a regional advantage into diversified, multinational power. The surface indicators were impressive. Scale, output, asset range, and geographic reach all suggested durability. But corporate strength can become deceptive when the very process of becoming larger obscures which parts of the system are carrying disproportionate weight. If one foreign mine is quietly generating the majority of profits, then the empire may be broad in appearance but narrow in dependence. That pattern would matter later. In the 1920s and early 1930s, what mattered more visibly was Anaconda's place in the speculative and financial culture of the era. Like many large firms, it was not insulated from the fevered market environment that culminated in the crash of 1929. Copper prices could be managed, stock values could be manipulated, and industrial reputation could feed speculative excess. When the market turned and the depression deepened, Anaconda suffered heavily. Copper demand fell. Dividends were cut. Share values collapsed. Yet, even the depression did not erase the company. That durability says something about both the depth of the asset base and the strategic importance of copper. The company bent, but it did not vanish. Then World War II revived demand on a scale that again made copper indispensable to modern conflict. Wires, shell casings, electrical systems, communications equipment, industrial machinery. War pulled copper back to the center of national necessity. Anaconda's operations surged. The company ranked among major war contractors. Butte and associated facilities again mattered intensely to national production. This wartime revival is important because it delayed reckoning. It is common in industrial history for war-to-rescue systems whose peacetime economics are already under strain. The emergency demand of total conflict masks structural problems that reappear afterward. For Anaconda, wartime success reinforced the idea that the company remained fundamental and resilient. Yet beneath that confidence, old pressures were gathering. Aging operations in Butte, rising costs, or depletion challenges, labor complexity, and a profit structure increasingly tilted toward Chile. In the 1950s, the company adapted again. It diversified further into aluminum and other areas. It invested in open-pit methods, including the Berkeley pit, as underground mining economics shifted. In 1955 it formally shortened its name from the Anaconda Copper Mining Company to the Anaconda Company, a linguistic change that reflected broader ambitions. It was no longer presenting itself as only a copper miner, even if copper remained the core of its identity and fortunes. By 1960, the company employed tens of thousands across North America and Chile. This looked like mature industrial power, the kind that boards and analysts call strategic. But scale can hide fragility in two ways. First, by spreading attention so widely that management begins to mistake reach for resilience. Second, by normalizing the assumption that political conditions abroad will remain stable enough for profits to continue. The second illusion would prove fatal. It is easy, looking back, to describe Anaconda's Chilean operations as an obvious risk. At the time, they did not feel obvious to the people collecting the profits. That is how concentration usually works. It does not first appear as danger. It appears as efficiency. Chuquicamata was a spectacular asset. Its ore body, scale, and long-term productive capacity made it one of the premier copper mines on Earth. In strict business terms, the acquisition was brilliant. It gave Anaconda access to a deposit so large that for many years Chilean production accounted for a dominant share of the company's profits. For executives and shareholders, that kind of asset does not look like a trap. It looks like proof that management understands the future. But there is a difference between owning a productive foreign asset and controlling the political conditions that make foreign ownership possible. Chile in the mid-20th century was not a blank corporate landscape. It was a country whose economic life had become deeply entangled with foreign capital, especially in copper. The industry generated massive revenue, and much of the most profitable production remained in the hands of American corporations. For Chileans across the political spectrum, this raised increasingly urgent questions. Who owned the country's most strategic resource? Who captured the profits? How much remained in Chile? How long could a nation define sovereignty in political terms while allowing the commanding heights of its mineral economy to remain externally controlled? These questions did not emerge suddenly with Salvador Allende. They built over time. By the 1950s and 1960s, nationalization or partial national control of the major copper mines was no longer a fringe dream. It had entered mainstream politics. Different governments approached the issue differently, through negotiation, Chileanization, partial share purchases, and eventually outright expropriation, but the direction of travel had become visible well before the final break. And Anaconda knew this. This is one of the most important corrections to simplistic corporate tragedy narratives. The company was not blindsided by the mere existence of political risk. It monitored Chile closely. It purchased insurance against expropriation through American channels designed precisely for that purpose. It negotiated under governments that were already seeking greater national control. It watched campaign rhetoric. It understood that copper in Chile was not just an industry but a sovereignty question. What it failed to do was reduce its dependence on the asset quickly enough to survive losing it. Part of that failure was structural. When one foreign mine is providing an enormous share of total profits, management becomes psychologically attached to continuation. To diversify away from that profit stream would mean admitting vulnerability while the numbers still look strong. Few executives volunteer for that kind of self-critique during prosperous years. So the risk remains acknowledged but uncorrected. By the late 1960s, Chilean politics had made the issue unmistakable. Eduardo Free's government advanced a process often described as Chileanization, involving increased state ownership and more formal national participation in the industry. But this was not the endpoint for many Chileans. It was a stage. The deeper demand was that the mines should belong fully to Chile. Then came the election of Salvador Allende in 1970. Allende's victory did not create the issue, it accelerated it toward completion. He had campaigned openly on nationalizing the major copper mines. Once in office, his government moved to do exactly that, backed by broad domestic support and by a nationalist argument that transcended narrow ideological categories. In July 1971, Chile's Congress unanimously approved the constitutional amendment enabling nationalization of the large foreign-owned copper mines. The unanimity matters. This was not a razor-thin partisan maneuver. It expressed a rare and forceful political consensus. For Anaconda, the consequences were devastating. The company lost Chuquicamata and other Chilean assets with compensation terms far below what it wanted and, in important respects, effectively punitive. Chilean authorities argued that prior excess profits should be deducted from any compensation owed. From the point of view of the Chilean state, nationalization was not theft but reclamation. From the point of view of the corporation and much of the U.S. establishment, it was a direct assault on property and on the security of American investment abroad. Both interpretations mattered because they shaped the legal and diplomatic struggle that followed. But neither interpretation changed the central economic fact. Anaconda had lost the foreign engine that had been carrying so much of its profit structure. This is where a documentary should slow down rather than speed up. Corporate collapses are often narrated as if one event destroys everything instantly. In reality, systems weakened by a shock may stagger for years. Anaconda did not cease to exist the moment Chile nationalized its mines. It entered a condition of strategic bleeding. Debt obligations remained. Expectations remained. Domestic operations remained. But the balance between assets, liabilities, and future prospects had been fundamentally altered. And the injury was not isolated. Around the same period, Mexican nationalization affected Anaconda's position there as well. The company was confronting a wider truth of the post-war world. Resource-rich states were increasingly unwilling to leave strategic minerals under terms written in an earlier era of foreign control. There is a temptation in American business history to treat such reversals as moral fables about anti-business politics. That would be too simple here. What happened to Anaconda in Chile was also a story about the limits of corporate imagination. The company had built its empire under the assumption that profitable control abroad could continue as long as operations remained technically effective and politically connected enough. But foreign assets do not ultimately rest on technical performance alone. They rest on local legitimacy, state power, and the willingness of a nation to accept the terms under which outsiders profit from its resources. By 1971, Chile was no longer willing to accept those terms. What followed was more than a loss statement. It was the beginning of a forced unraveling. Assets that had looked like components of a stable multinational future now had to be reread through crisis. Expansion no longer signified strength. It signified exposure. The company that had once seemed too deeply integrated into modern industry to break had discovered that one of its deepest foundations stood on foreign ground. And foreign ground can vote. After Chile, Anaconda's decline was not theatrical at first. It was administrative, financial, and therefore, in some ways, more dangerous. Companies do not necessarily collapse when the public sees the problem. They collapse when the internal arithmetic changes and management begins making decisions from weakness rather than from strategy. That is what happened here. The loss of the Chilean profit base came at a terrible moment because it intersected with other pressures. Copper prices were volatile. Some of the company's domestic assets were aging or less efficient. Certain investments, including the Twin Buttes project in Arizona, did not perform as hoped. Debt and restructuring pressure intensified. And perhaps most importantly, the company no longer had the luxury of time. Empires can survive single bad years. They struggle to survive structural shocks when every major decision must now be made under financial urgency. This is where the distinction between revenue and viability becomes essential. Anaconda still had operations. It still had name recognition. It still had mining expertise, domestic properties, industrial assets, and long habits of scale. But viability is not the same as size. A firm can remain large while becoming fragile. In fact, large firms often become fragile in uniquely dangerous ways because their overhead, expectations, and debt structures were built for a version of the future that no longer exists. The company tried to maneuver. Legal action, compensation claims, asset sales, internal adjustments, and corporate repositioning all formed part of the response. But what had been lost in Chile was not easily replaceable. Chuquicamata had not merely contributed earnings, it had helped subsidize the sense that the rest of the empire was still durable. Once that pillar was removed, management and investors had to ask a question that mature industrial systems often avoid for as long as possible. What is the company really worth without the assumptions that made its peak possible? The answer was grim. Asset sales began to look less like strategic tidying and more like surrender under pressure. Timber holdings, manufacturing connections, and other components of the wider enterprise now served not as symbols of diversified power but as resources that might be liquidated to keep the structure alive a little longer. This is an important emotional turn in the documentary. The same system that once swallowed up land, industries, and towns in the name of expansion now had to sell parts of itself to meet obligations. One can almost hear the historical irony. A company that had dominated Montana so thoroughly that many residents believed the state itself bent around its will was now being bent by creditors, politics, global commodity markets, and the consequences of overconcentration. Power had not vanished, but it had changed direction. Instead of flowing outward from Anaconda, it was flowing into the company from forces it could not command. In boardrooms, this kind of condition often produces fantasies of rescue through acquisition. If the existing structure cannot stabilize itself, perhaps another company with more cash, better positioning, or a broader energy portfolio can absorb the problem and produce new synergies. Corporate history is littered with such hopes. Usually the language surrounding them is optimistic. New combinations, operational efficiencies, strategic alignment, long-term value creation. The reality is often closer to triage. By the mid-1970s, Anaconda had become a plausible target. And here we reach one of the most revealing transitions in the story, because it shows how expertise can be misunderstood by outsiders intoxicated by capital abundance. The buyer that arrived was Atlantic Richfield Company, ARCO, an oil company energized by the wealth and confidence produced by the North Slope and the transformed energy economy of the 1970s. To ARCO, Anaconda appeared to offer land, resources, technical capability, and a potential platform for broader energy ambitions, including shale. On paper, such a purchase could be explained. Both firms dealt with extraction. Both worked with geological resources. Both operated at industrial scale. The analogy was strong enough to support a major acquisition. But analogies are not competence. An oil company is not automatically equipped to run a hard rock mining empire simply because both involve taking value out of the earth. Petroleum reservoirs, open-pit copper systems, underground metal mining, smelting, labor traditions, environmental legacies, geological interpretation, and market cycles all operate according to different rhythms and requirements. What ARCO purchased was not just a collection of assets. It was a highly specialized industrial civilization. And specialized industrial civilizations are not easy to absorb without loss. The sale in 1977 marked the end of Anaconda as an independent historical actor, but not the end of Anaconda's consequences. That distinction is crucial. Corporate ownership can change in a day. The physical systems created by a company, the pits, shafts, slag, towns, water pathways, labor histories, and legal liabilities, do not change on the same schedule. From the perspective of narrative structure, the sale should feel less like a conclusion than like a prelude to misunderstanding. A buyer with money is about to discover that assets built across generations contain knowledge that does not transfer cleanly in a transaction. Meanwhile, the old company's decline is already telling us something larger about the 20th century industrial order. Firms that looked sovereign at their peak often turn out to be highly contingent, dependent on geopolitical tolerance, commodity cycles, inherited expertise, and managers who understand what they actually own. Anaconda had mistaken a long period of dominance for security. When the outer world changed, the mistake became visible. And now the company was passing into the hands of owners who did not fully understand the difference between possession and mastery. The sale of Anaconda to Atlantic Richfield in 1977 is one of the most instructive episodes in the whole story because it exposes a mistake that recurs across industries: the belief that capital can purchase not only assets but the practical knowledge that made those assets function. ARCO had money. What it did not have was a century of accumulated experience in hard rock mining, smelting culture, labor relations in Butte, or the local geological intimacy on which safe and efficient operation depended. Those things are not intangible in the vague corporate sense. They are tangible in the most literal way possible. They live in people, routines, maintenance habits, technical judgments, and institutional memory. If you shut down a shaft, flood a working, change a processing method, or alter a production schedule without understanding the specific system you are inheriting, you may discover too late that the old operators were not simply being conservative. They were managing realities you have not yet perceived. That appears to be part of what happened. ARCO's ambitions were linked to a wider energy logic shaped by the oil economy. Some of the purchase rationale involved hopes that Anaconda's resources and technical base could support broader ventures, including shale-related possibilities. But the strategic environment shifted. Oil gluts and changing economics undercut those ambitions. What remained was a copper company operating in a difficult market under managers whose core expertise lay elsewhere. Then copper prices weakened. This mattered because a cyclical commodity business punishes owners who misread temporary downturns as proof of terminal decline. Experienced mining operators understand that not every price collapse justifies dismantling a system that took generations to assemble. They weigh reserves, future demand, operating flexibility, and the cost of losing a skilled workforce. In contrast, owners without deep sector knowledge may see the downturn, the complexity, and the labor challenge and conclude that exit is safer than adaptation. ARCO began pulling back. Underground mining in Butte was halted. The smelter at Anaconda closed in 1980, bringing nearly a century of continuous smelting history to an end. Jobs disappeared. The company town Marcus Daly had created around furnaces and reduction works lost the institution that had organized its life. These were not merely employment changes. They were civic shocks. In places built around one dominant industrial system, closure does not feel like a normal market adjustment. It feels like the removal of a foundation. In Butte, the retreat continued. The Berkeley Pit, already a brutal transformation of the city's landscape, ceased to be an active mining engine and began to become something else. The pumps that had kept groundwater from filling the mines and pit were shut off in 1982. From a narrow accounting perspective, the decision could be defended as part of withdrawal from an uneconomic operation. From the perspective of long-term environmental consequence, it was the beginning of a disaster whose full scale would take years to become visible. This is where industrial history and environmental history stop being separate subjects. When the pumps stopped, water moved into a system that had been artificially managed for decades. Underground workings flooded. The pit filled. Sulfide-rich rock, oxygen, water, and time combined to create acid mine drainage on a staggering scale. Heavy metals dissolved into solution. What had once been an open-pit symbol of industrial confidence slowly became a giant toxic reservoir. ARCO did not invent every environmental problem in the district. Those problems were the accumulated legacy of a much longer mining and smelting history. But ARCO made a decision that effectively abandoned an intensely managed industrial landscape without an adequate long-term solution already in place. That distinction matters. It is one thing to inherit an environmentally compromised system. It is another to exit it in a way that lets chemistry and hydrology continue the work of destruction. Meanwhile, the social cost rippled outward. When heavy industry leaves towns built to serve it, the first losses are visible in payroll and storefronts. The deeper losses arrive later, in shrinking expectations, in school populations, in the meaning of local skill, in the quiet fact that the best-paying work without a college degree is now gone. Anaconda, Montana, took that blow especially hard. Butte took it differently because its economic base had always been somewhat more varied and its identity more urban. Yet both places were being forced to confront the same question. What does a community do when the company that justified its scale and institutions decides history is no longer worth funding? ARCO's ownership also highlights another truth about corporate succession. A buyer may think it is purchasing a future opportunity and discover instead that it has inherited a past. That past is not romantic. It is legal, chemical, geographic, and moral. It includes tailings, slag, poisoned soils, altered creeks, unstable workings, union memory, town dependence, and regulatory liabilities. These do not vanish because the acquiring company's strategic thesis changes. In 2000, BP's acquisition of ARCO meant that responsibility for much of this cleanup legacy would pass again, this time to a global oil major with no direct connection to Marcus Daly, Butte's rise, or the original smelting era. It is one of the great absurdities of industrial capitalism that a 19th-century mining empire can end by handing its environmental liabilities to a 21st-century multinational structured around completely different historical origins. But before we jump ahead to the cleanup era, pause on the symbolic reversal. Marcus Daly built a system by refusing dependence, building rail lines, smelters, towns, and industrial chains to keep outside leverage limited. A century later, that system ended not in mastery but in corporate misfit. It was sold, misunderstood, shut down, and left to fill with water. The empire had once seemed too integrated to die. Instead, its very complexity became one of the reasons new owners could not keep it alive. The Berkeley Pit is one of those places that can mislead the eye because what it looks like from a viewing platform is not what it is chemically or historically. Seen from above, it is almost painterly. The benches curve inward in giant terraced arcs. The colors shift with light and concentration, sometimes rusted orange, sometimes reddish brown, sometimes a vivid blue-green that looks more like a mineral spring than an industrial waste reservoir. Distance creates beauty. But distance also erases sequence. The pit can appear to a visitor like a strange natural feature rather than the product of decisions layered across decades. It was not natural. It was engineered enlargement in service of cheaper extraction. Beginning in the mid-1950s, as underground mining costs rose and/or grades changed, open-pit mining looked economically attractive. The Berkeley operation expanded by eating into Butte's eastern neighborhoods, swallowing land where people had lived, walked, worshipped, and raised families. Whole sections of the city disappeared beneath the logic of mechanized scale. When people speak of the city being consumed by mining, this is not metaphor. Streets, homes, and community geography were physically erased. During active operation, the Berkeley pit was an emblem of industrial modernization. It represented efficiency over tradition, machinery over older underground craft, bulk movement over labor-intensive depth. But when extraction ceased and water began to accumulate, the pit acquired a new identity. Not the future of mining, but the afterlife of mining. Acid mine drainage is not a poetic term. It is chemistry with social consequences. Much of the exposed rock in and around the pit contains sulfide minerals such as pyrite. When sulfide-bearing rock encounters water and oxygen, oxidation reactions occur. Acid forms. That acidic solution mobilizes metals from surrounding rock. Microorganisms can accelerate parts of the process. What results is a self-reinforcing system in which water becomes increasingly hostile to most forms of life and increasingly loaded with dissolved contaminants. The pit is now part of a larger flooded mine system and a major component of the Butte Mine Flooding Operable Unit within the broader Superfund framework. It is monitored continuously because it is not just a scenic hazard. If the water rises too high relative to the protective water level, contaminated water could move toward connected groundwater systems in ways that threaten broader environmental and public health outcomes. That is why pumping and treatment are now permanent features of the site's modern management. Permanent is the crucial word. When industrial promoters celebrate a mine, they speak in the language of jobs, output, innovation, and national development. Rarely do they describe the possibility that the site may require active management forever. But that is the implication here. The mine may be closed, yet the work it set in motion continues indefinitely. The company is gone, but pumps, treatment plants, environmental monitoring, and institutional attention must remain. The waterfowl incidents turned this hidden continuation into something more visible to the public. In 1995, hundreds of migrating snow geese landed on the pit and died. The incident quickly became emblematic of the site's danger, though some aspects of exact causation were debated. What mattered culturally was that the pit ceased to be merely a local industrial remnant. It became a vivid national image, a man-made lake so contaminated that birds could mistake it for refuge and die on it. Later, in 2016, thousands more snow geese died after landing there during severe weather, renewing public attention and expanding the site's waterfowl deterrence efforts. These incidents matter narratively because they translate abstract contamination into a visible tragedy that non-specialists can immediately understand. But the more important environmental story extends beyond birds. The wider Butte Anaconda Upper Clark Fork system absorbed a century of tailings, slag, smelter emissions, contaminated soils, poisoned stream banks, and altered hydrology. The Berkeley pit is visually famous because it is spectacular. The larger contamination footprint is in some ways more consequential because it extends across communities, watersheds, and generations. Still, the pit remains the perfect visual symbol of deferred cost. It is literally a void created for profit and later filled by chemical consequence. And yet, even here the story resists simplification. Researchers associated with Montana Tech and other scientific efforts have studied the microbial life in the Berkeley Pit and its surrounding waters, finding extremophile organisms capable of surviving conditions lethal to most life forms. Some compounds derived from such organisms have shown promise in biomedical research, including work related to bioactive metabolites. One should be careful not to romanticize this too far. A toxic industrial site does not become redeemed because it contains scientifically interesting microbes. But the fact is striking nonetheless. The ruined chemistry of industrial extraction created conditions in which unusual life adapted, and some of that life may carry knowledge useful to medicine. This is not redemption. It is complication. The Berkeley Pit is therefore many things at once: an industrial ruin, a hydrological threat, an environmental classroom, a tourist site, a legal liability, a memory machine, and an ongoing scientific laboratory. Visitors pay to look into it. Children learn about it. Scientists sample it. Engineers manage it. Former workers and residents see in it the afterimage of a city restructured by corporate decisions. Nobody standing at the rail can encounter the pit without also encountering a question. How far does responsibility travel in time? If the answer is only until the last profitable quarter, then places like this make sense. If the answer extends as long as the chemistry continues, then the historical ledger looks very different. In that ledger, mines do not end when the company exits. They end when the landscape is no longer paying compound interest on old decisions. At Berkeley, that end has not come. And that means the story of Anaconda is still being told not only in archives and books, but in water level charts, treatment infrastructure, soil advisories, and the simple fact that a corporate century remains physically active beneath an open Montana sky. If Berkeley Pit is the most famous remnant of the Anaconda Empire, the Great Stack at Anaconda is the most haunting. It rises from the valley like a monument built by an industrial civilization for reasons it never intended to admit. Nearly 600 feet tall, brick-lined, and visible for miles, the stack was designed to move contamination away from the immediate furnaces and disperse it more widely. That engineering choice makes it an almost perfect symbol of the era that produced it. Industrial efficiency solved one local operational problem by enlarging the geography of exposure. Today the stack survives while much of the smelter complex around it does not. Its survival is not accidental. When the smelter closed, demolition of the stack was planned. Residents fought to save it. That fight matters because it reveals how industrial ruins can become identity anchors even when they are tied to damage. People in Anaconda did not defend the stack because they misunderstood its history. They defended it because it had become inseparable from the town's own. To erase it would have been to erase not only contamination but memory, labor, and scale, the visible proof that this small Montana place had once stood inside a global industrial system. That tension runs through the entire post-industrial landscape of Anaconda. The town was born as a company instrument. Marcus Daly planted it where the smelter needed it. Streets, institutions, and daily life grew around the reduction works. Families built lives there not because the valley had some neutral historical destiny, but because corporate strategy placed furnaces in that location and then required workers to stay near them. When the smelter thrived, that arrangement produced wages, social life, schools, churches, and civic pride. When the smelter shut down, the dependency built into the town's origin became stark. Company towns can develop genuine community, but they cannot escape the fact that their underlying economic architecture was designed for one dominant employer. Remove the employer, and the town must either reinvent itself or live indefinitely with a kind of historical phantom limb. Anaconda has done both. Visitors today can encounter careful downtown preservation, the stack as state park landmark, and a landscape that seems at moments to have folded industrial ruins into heritage. But the soil remembers more literally than heritage language sometimes allows. Parts of the old smelter site remained hazardous. Cleanup, removal, capping, and long-term monitoring have been necessary. Residential exposure concerns, especially around arsenic and lead, have shaped public health actions. In some areas, the ordinary categories of backyard, playground, and historic neighborhood have had to coexist with the vocabulary of remediation. This coexistence is often what living in the aftermath of extraction means. The damage is not total enough to erase daily life, and daily life is not stable enough to make the damage disappear. One of the strangest visual juxtapositions in the Anaconda story is the transformation of former industrial ground into recreational and aestheticized space. Redevelopment, golf landscapes, managed open areas, interpretive signage. These can make a site legible to outsiders without fully communicating its depth of contamination or its emotional history. This is not necessarily dishonest. Communities need usable land and new economic identities. But it can create a surface calm over a subsurface reality. Beneath the grass lies slag, altered soil, and the residue of a century whose externalities were once accepted as the unavoidable price of greatness. The editor should make a deliberate choice here. Do not present the town merely as a victim preserved in amber. Show ordinary life. Show downtown blocks, local events, the stack at different distances, preserved buildings, empty stretches, memorial interpretation, and any signs of present-tense civic reinvention. Anaconda is not dead. What it carries is not death but inheritance. The difference matters. Inheritance can be burdensome. It can also become a source of identity precisely because it is shared. Residents who save the stack are making a statement more complex than nostalgia. They are refusing the idea that the company gets to define the town first by dominating it, and then by erasing its physical traces when domination ends. To keep the stack is, in a sense, to insist that memory belongs to the people who lived under it, not only to the managers who justified it. And yet memory here is never clean. The same structure preserved as heritage also marks a toxic plume history. The same town born through wages was also shaped by fumes. The same company that offered stability also built dependency. Industrial history is like that. It rarely allows morally pure remembrance. This is why the Anaconda chapter should feel quieter than the Berkeley Pit chapter, but not smaller. Berkeley is spectacle. Anaconda is residue. Berkeley gives you visible terror from a single railing. Anaconda gives you a more subtle lesson. The cost of empire can settle into streets and soil so thoroughly that a town learns to carry it as ordinary reality. That quietness is powerful. It reminds the viewer that the story of Anaconda is not only a rise and fall corporate epic. It is also a story about what it means to remain in a place after the institution that built it has gone. Workers leave. Some stay. Children grow up among landmarks whose meanings are split between pride and contamination. The stack keeps standing, tall enough to dominate the horizon, inaccessible enough to remind you that monument and hazard are not opposites here. In a different sort of historical imagination, the stack would have been demolished and the story simplified. Montana would have one fewer industrial scar. But it would also lose a material witness. Its survival keeps the argument open. What did this empire give? What did it take? And who gets to answer now that the company itself is gone? One of the most difficult ideas to communicate in industrial history is that cleanup is not a final stage. It is often a permanent condition. The Butte Anaconda and Upper Clark Fork cleanup complex is vast. Federal and state agencies, responsible parties, scientists, contractors, hydrologists, toxicologists, and local communities have spent decades in a process that is part engineering, part public health, part legal negotiation, part habitat restoration, and part argument over what "done" can even mean in a landscape transformed at this scale. The area has long been described as among the largest Superfund cleanups in the United States. That phrase is accurate, but it can become numbingly bureaucratic. To recover its meaning, you have to return it to place. It means contaminated streambeds and floodplains downstream of historic operations. It means heavy metals in soils, tailings, and sediments. It means treatment systems designed to prevent poisoned water from moving where it should not. It means families learning to live with advisories, testing, and remediation schedules. It means lawyers and engineers inheriting decisions made by men who are long dead. And it means that the cost of industrial extraction, once celebrated as private achievement, eventually becomes a public administrative burden even when private parties remain legally responsible for paying parts of it. This last point is crucial. The accounting that made Anaconda's empire appear profitable in its own time did not fully internalize what later generations would have to manage. That is not unusual. In fact, it is historically normal. The industrial 19th and 20th centuries are full of enterprises whose balance sheets looked healthy because future environmental liabilities were either unknown, externalized, or treated as politically ignorable. Only later, under different laws and different moral assumptions, do societies attempt to reconstruct the real price. In Butte and Anaconda, that reconstruction has been slow and contentious because the damage is dispersed, layered, and technically difficult. There is no single switch that turns a century of mining and smelting back into pre-industrial condition. Even the language of restoration can be misleading if it implies full return. Much of this work is better understood as risk reduction, containment, treatment, stabilization, and partial ecological recovery under ongoing management. Yet progress has been real. Sections of streams have been remediated. Tailings have been removed or isolated. Habitats have been improved. Treatment systems have been installed and refined. Research has deepened understanding. Formerly neglected or normalized contamination has been made visible in public policy and law. The story should not be told as though nothing has changed except the logos on the responsible company's paperwork. That would be inaccurate. But progress does not mean finality. The protective water level at Berkeley remains a hard constraint. Soil issues in and around the old smelter zones remain serious. Large landscapes across the watershed continue to require monitoring and intervention. And the very existence of permanent treatment infrastructure is evidence that the system has not been solved in the way a closed historical chapter is solved. It has been managed into a new phase of obligation. That obligation crosses generations. Children born long after the last furnace cooled inherit landscapes whose risks were created before they were alive. Taxpayers, residents, regulators, and multinational corporations all become actors in a drama that began with 19th-century mineral ambition. That temporal reach is one reason this history still matters. It reveals that industrial decisions are not confined to the lifespan of the executives who make them. They are often more durable than any corporate charter. This chapter also gives the editor an opportunity to move beyond archival nostalgia and show the modern machinery of accountability. Use footage or stills of remediation sites, treatment plants, warning signage, stream restoration, monitoring equipment, capped ground, and agency maps. Show the paperwork world that follows the heroic world. It is a different kind of image, but it is part of the same story. Industrial triumph produced environmental administration. There is another emotional layer here as well. Cleanup creates a strange relationship between local people and the past. On one hand, many communities want acknowledgement, repair, and safer land. On the other hand, endless cleanup can feel like endless indictment, as though the places that once took pride in industry are condemned to be known only through contamination. That tension is real in post-industrial towns. People do not want to romanticize poison. They also do not want every conversation about home to begin and end with liability. A mature documentary should respect both sides of that feeling. The purpose is not to humiliate the past, nor to flatter it. It is to show that material achievements and material harms were produced together, and that any honest reckoning has to make space for both memory and remediation. If the company's active life was measured in quarters, shifts, contracts, and production records, its afterlife is measured in monitoring wells, 5-year reviews, health advisories, and incremental restoration. That may sound anticlimactic, but in moral terms it is not. It is the era in which a society finally admits that what was once called externality is actually inheritance. And inheritances, unlike press releases, do not disappear when management changes. At a certain point in this story, the viewer may be tempted to ask a simple question. Was Anaconda a great company or a destructive one? The honest answer is that the question is too simple for the scale of what happened. Anaconda helped build the material infrastructure of modern America. That is not rhetorical inflation. Copper from Butte and from the company's wider system moved into electrical grids, communications networks, transportation systems, war production, and industrial manufacturing at the exact moment those systems were becoming the skeleton of 20th century life. The company also provided generations of workers with wages, identities, and routes into a more secure life than many alternatives of their era offered. At the same time, Anaconda concentrated political power to a degree that distorted democratic life in Montana. It operated in labor systems where the cost of output could include avoidable danger and overt repression. It embraced global arrangements that were enormously profitable but ultimately brittle and politically vulnerable. It externalized environmental costs on a scale still being managed decades after the last production surge. It created company dependence so deep that towns and regions were forced to absorb enormous shock when strategy changed. So what did it actually build? It built electricity, yes. It built cities and towns, yes. It built fortunes, infrastructures, and industrial confidence. But it also built a template. That template is worth naming because it extends far beyond Montana and far beyond copper. First, it showed how a resource company can evolve from local operation into a governing institution. Once payroll, press influence, transport, and political leverage align, the company stops being just a market actor. It becomes a condition of public life. Second, it showed how vertically integrated strength can conceal hidden concentration. An empire can appear diversified while depending too heavily on one region, one deposit, or one political arrangement. When that single pillar fails, the whole structure moves. Third, it demonstrated that industrial knowledge is not reducible to ownership. Tacit expertise, local practice, and labor memory matter. ARCO's difficulties underscore how costly it can be to confuse paper control with operational understanding. Fourth, it revealed the asymmetry between profit time and environmental time. Companies report by quarter. Landscapes respond by decade, century, or longer. When a corporation succeeds by ignoring that asymmetry, later generations inherit the difference. And fifth, Anaconda built a mythology that still shapes how Americans think about industrial rise and industrial decline. The mythology says an immigrant sees what others miss, builds a colossal enterprise, powers national growth, defeats rivals, conquers geography, and then leaves behind ruins so consequential that they become educational landmarks and federal case files. It is a story of brilliance, ambition, control, blindness, and deferred consequence all braided together. That is why the company still matters. Not because every viewer needs to memorize the sequence of acquisitions or the details of copper chemistry, though those matter. It matters because the pattern keeps repeating in other forms. Build around one extractive advantage. Tie communities to it. Celebrate the output. Use political influence to stabilize your terms. Globalize the profit. Underprice the future costs. Then act surprised when geopolitics, market shifts, labor conflict, or environmental reckoning turn strength into liability. Anaconda is not merely a Montana story. It is a corporate state story. It is a resource nationalism story. It is a labor violence story. It is an environmental accounting story. And it is a story about how modern societies repeatedly convince themselves that scale is the same thing as permanence. It is not. To say this clearly is not to erase the workers whose pride in the mines and smelter was genuine. Their pride was real. To say it is not to deny the productive significance of copper to national development. That significance was immense. It is simply to insist that historical admiration without historical accounting produces bad memory. Good memory is more demanding. Good memory can admire Marcus Daly's operational genius while acknowledging that company towns lock people to corporate fate. Good memory can recognize Butte's extraordinary working-class culture while refusing to excuse the conditions that produced mass death underground. Good memory can honor the labor that wired a nation while asking why the landscape that made the wire is still being medically, chemically, and legally managed generations later. Good memory can preserve the stack without pretending the smoke was harmless. That is what this documentary should leave the audience with. Not a slogan, not a cartoon, and not a sentimental ruin-porn vision of the American past, but a harder understanding. Anaconda built modernity in metal. It also demonstrated what happens when the systems that build modernity are allowed to treat places and people as expendable inputs in a larger machine. The copper ran through the walls of a new century. The consequences stayed in the ground. Stand above the Berkeley pit long enough, and the mind starts trying to simplify what it sees. You tell yourself it is a dead mine, a lesson, a relic, a monument to an age that has ended. But it is not ended. Water still has to be managed. Soil still has to be monitored. Historical blame still has to be translated into legal responsibility. Researchers still study the chemistry. Families still live in the shadow of choices made before they were born. Towns still negotiate how to honor the labor without sanitizing the cost. The company is gone, yet its tense relationship with Montana remains active in the present tense. That is the final lesson. Industrial empires do not disappear when the logo comes down. They remain in rivers, in pension memories, in ruined neighborhoods, in state politics, in preserved skylines, in photographs of men whose names are no longer known, and in the technical systems built to keep the past from spreading further into the future. Marcus Daly could not have imagined the full afterlife of what he began. He could imagine ore, rail, smelter output, maybe political influence, maybe even global scale. What he could not imagine, what few industrial founders ever truly imagine, was that the landscape itself would become the longest living witness. If there is a single image that contains the whole story, it may not be the first strike of copper, or the tallest stack, or the richest years on the balance sheet. It may be something quieter. A visitor at the pit rail. A child being told why the water is that color. A town preserving a smokestack because losing even the dangerous monument would feel like losing the right to tell its own story. Anaconda once made Montana bend. Now Montana keeps the evidence. And that may be the most lasting reversal of all.